Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me one quick favor, see that little black subscribe button on the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Really does help this channel grow, my audience grow, and I appreciate it more than you know. Also, quick thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet $50 on any game. Get up to $1,111 in free bets courtesy of the Betfred Sportsbook. Thank you again. Now, here's the video that you came here for. But what I want to talk about today is the hot seat in college football's hot seat going into the season. Now, I know what some people in the media say. I don't talk about that stuff. I don't like to talk about another man's job. Well, here's the thing. You know our policy here on the Aaron Torres Pod. If you stink at your job, I'm going to talk about you. Sorry, that's the reality. This is big boy college football. And like, these are important conversations to have. I also believe that it's important from the perspective of it really does give the listener, the consumer, whomever, a good perspective of really who is in what position going into this year. We know guys like Nick Saban and whoever, you know, Lincoln Riley, Kirby Smart, they're gods where they are. But then you have these other guys that are fighting for their jobs. And I can just go back to last year. At this time last year, we were talking about 4 guys really ultimately being on the hot seat. And all 4 of them had struggled out of the gate and were gone within weeks. Scott Frost in Nebraska, Brian Harsin at Auburn, Herm Edwards, our old buddy at Arizona State. And then also on top of that, the 4th guy was Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech. So this stuff really does matter going into the year. All the hot seat lists are starting to come out. I saw Ross Dellinger from Yahoo put his out on Monday. So this just feels like a good time to talk about it. In my opinion, there are 3-4 guys that we really need to discuss because they are fighting for their dear lives. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get into it. The first guy on the list, I'll be blunt. It's not who you think it is. I'm going to pull the old Jerry Maguire. I'm not going to do what you all think I'm going to do. And in this case, that's lead with Jimbo Fisher. Jimbo Fisher has a hot seat. We're going to talk about it in a minute. But when I think of the single guy, the single person who is fighting for his job at the Power 5 level more than anyone else, I believe it's actually Neil Brown from Jimbo Fisher's home state of West Virginia. For people who haven't followed West Virginia or thought about West Virginia, that's kind of the point. I was thinking about this today, okay? I was thinking, what is the last truly memorable moment in West Virginia football history? We don't necessarily have to go back to the Pat White, Steve Slayton days, but I mean, just think about it. Is it when they beat Clemson in the Orange Bowl a million years ago? Is it Geno Smith? There haven't been a lot. And then there really haven't been a lot since Dana Holgorsen left 5 years ago. So Neil Brown is now going into year 5. And for whatever reason, it just hasn't clicked. Was really good at Troy. He's kind of from he's from Kentucky. So West Virginia is a bordering state, but it just has not clicked for Neil Brown for whatever reason. Here are the win-loss records for Neil Brown heading into his 5th year as the head coach at West Virginia. 5-7 in year 1, 6-4 in year 2. That was the COVID year. They only played 10 games. 6-7 last year, 6-7 this past season, or 6-7 2 seasons ago, 6-7 last year as well. And so I bring it up because when you're talking about a guy at the Power 5 level, you're talking about a guy that is going into year 5 at a big boy school, a state school that has a history of success. And I know things have gotten tougher since you go to the Big 12. You can't have a 6th bad year and expect to survive another season. And so when I look at West Virginia, I'll be blunt. I don't think it's pretty because I don't know that he does what he needs to do to win enough games. When I think about this West Virginia program under his watch, 1, not enough big wins. Big 12 is tough. A lot of good teams. But I was also thinking about this as I was kind of preparing for this segment. His problem, I believe, like what if it doesn't go well? What do you sell people on the future, right? Because I think about this with West Virginia. Every program kind of has an identity, right? I say a team, you think of something. I say Georgia, you think power football, physicality, beat you up, elite. I say Texas, you can make fun of Steve Sarkisian, but you know they're going to throw the ball all over the field. You know they're going to be explosive on offense. Same with USC and Lincoln Riley. We think of Colorado as Coach Prime and the transfer school. We'll see what happens. We think of Ole Miss as the transfer school. We think of whomever, Tennessee, throwing the ball all over the field. West Virginia, I don't think has an identity. So I'm not going to beat around the bush. Bottom line with this guy is I think he's got to win. And I think the other factor, too, is remember, the Big 12 adds 4 new teams this year. And I was thinking about this. Imagine if Central Florida, UCF, comes in and wins, say, 8-9 games. Or BYU, I think, could be better than people expect, and they win 7, 8, 9 games. You go 6 and 7 again, you have teams that are coming into this league that weren't even in the league that are winning games that you're not supposed to, that they're not supposed to. I think it could get ugly, and I think it could get ugly quick. The schedule is brutal. They open at Penn State. They play the backyard brawl in week 3. Texas Tech, a really good team in week 4. At TCU in week 5. So I'm not rooting against anybody. I'm not saying that I listen, I hope it all works out well. This could get ugly, and it could get ugly early at Penn State, Texas Tech, at TCU early in the season, and the schedule doesn't get much better from there. All right, beyond Neil Brown, there is obviously one very big name that we have to discuss when it comes to the hot seat. That is Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M. And what I would say about Jimbo Fisher, I've shared my Jimbo Fisher takes a lot throughout this preseason. And the bottom line is, like, when I think about Jimbo Fisher, a couple things, like he's got to win. I don't think it's as toxic for him as some other guys. Like you think back to last year with Brian Harsin, I don't want to say everybody, a lot of people at Auburn were like, we don't want this guy. It ain't going to work. Get him out. You think back to whomever, even Neil Brown, what I just said, I think most of the fan base is turned. I still think there's a very good percentage of the Texas A&M fan base that wants Jimbo Fisher to have success, but at some point you got to deliver. Good thing for Jimbo Fisher, it really wasn't that bad until last year, but it did go bad last year, 5-7 overall, and even with that insane buyout, which, don't laugh, this is a fact, a $70 million buyout. I don't think Texas A&M wants to let him go, but if he goes 5-7 again this year, that's going to happen. Good news for Texas A&M, Jimbo Fisher. Listen, I've said it all offseason. I think this team is in position to make a nice step forward. It's a group that, as I've said a million times, went 5-7 last year, but lost 5 of those 7 games by a touchdown or less. That included a last-second loss, final play of the game to Alabama, a game against South Carolina where Texas A&M literally outscored South Carolina after the first play of the game. South Carolina returns the opening kickoff for a touchdown. Texas A&M outscores them from there. You go on and on down the list. I do think Bobby Petrino is going to help. I am not as sour on the Jimbo Fisher-Bobby Petrino relationship as everybody else. Everybody keeps talking about Jimbo Fisher needs Bobby Petrino to work. Bobby Petrino kind of needs this opportunity as well. Remember, this was an FCS head coach a year ago. He wants to end his career in the spotlight on a positive note. It's got to work here at Texas A&M. Finally, and I think this is sort of important, a lot of locker room problems last year, and it seems as though a lot of those locker room problems are gone. Don't wish ill will on anyone, especially young players, but I think it's worth noting that 2-3 of those guys that were suspended multiple times, multiple issues with the coaching staff a year ago, they've not only transferred, but in some cases, they aren't even with the schools that they transferred to. Chris Marshall, you heard behind the scenes, was a little bit of trouble, goes to Ole Miss. He already got kicked off the team. Smoke Bowie goes to Georgia. We heard he was trouble at Texas A&M, was suspended for a game. He ends up getting thrown off Georgia. Denver Harris, we heard good things at LSU early. He missed some time the last few days because of some personal reasons. Again, not rooting against anybody, but I do wonder, did some of those guys that maybe cause problems in the locker room, are they now gone? Is that good for the program? So listen, we know what's at stake for Jimbo. He's got to have a good year. I don't know if that's 8-4. I don't know if that's 9-3. My guess is with that star-studded 2022 high school recruiting class going into their sophomore years, you'd like to see Jimbo Fisher see that through. You don't want to fire Jimbo Fisher and have all those guys enter the portal and leave. But ultimately, Jimbo Fisher's got to do his job as well. Think A&M's in position for a nice bounce-back year. Think Jimbo Fisher's in better shape than Neil Brown. Third guy, and in my opinion, really the only other guy that I believe is in real tough shape going into this year, not the sexiest name from not the sexiest school in the Power Five. It's Tom Allen, the Indiana head football coach. And listen, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's Indiana football. But listen, this is now year 8. Heading into year 7 for Tom Allen. First 2 years goes 5-7. Okay, it's Indiana we're building. Year 3 goes 8-5. Okay, we got something. Year 4, that's the COVID year. They go 6-2. Follow that up with a 2-10 season 2 seasons ago, 4-8 last year. And so this is now year 7. You're coming off your 2 worst seasons. And bluntly, I don't really see what reason there is to think things will get better. This is a team that obviously plays in the brutal Big Ten East. This is a team that opens against Ohio State at home in week 1. It is worth noting, by the way, that is the first ever Big Ten on CBS game. That's right. Gary Danielson, Brad Nessler will be calling that game. CBS doesn't have the full Big Ten package this year, but they will eventually. Then Indiana plays a tough Louisville team out of conference. They play at Maryland, at Michigan, all before the middle of September. Still have Penn State and Wisconsin late in the year. And so bluntly, I think it could get ugly for Tom Allen. And so again, we're not going to spend a ton of time on Indiana, but what I was thinking about is this, is that with all the conference realignment coming up, I think there's a lot of schools that probably want their coaches to succeed. And you don't want to be making a change with all this crazy realignment stuff going on. With Indiana, though, I almost think it's the opposite. If Tom Allen crashes and burns, some would say, do you really want to fire a coach with the Big Ten kind of going through so much change over the next year with those 4 Pac-12 teams coming in, Oregon, Washington, UCLA, and USC? I look at it as the opposite. If you have 3 straight really bad years and the league's about to get tougher, it's probably time to move on. Those 3, in my opinion, hottest seats: Neil Brown, Jimbo Fisher, Tom Allen. And then everybody else, let's get to a couple others. One, let's just talk Steve Sarkisian really quick. Listen, I don't think Steve Sarkisian is on the quote-unquote hot seat. As Ross Dellinger said in his piece, the opposite is also true. Even if it doesn't appear that as though you're on the hot seat, the flip side is at Texas, you're always you're like a bad 3-game stretch away from being on the hot seat if you're Steve Sarkisian. So what I would say about Sark, listen, I think Texas is overrated again. He's never won more than 8 regular season games in his career. I don't know why people are picking them to make the playoff, to make the to even win the Big 12. I think there's a lot of questions about that. But at the same time, hot seat feels a little aggressive. Texas, to me, is almost the opposite of what I just said with Indiana. Indiana, it feels like you're going to want a fresh start going into the new era of the Big Ten next year. If you're Texas, you really hope that Sark is good enough so that you can have him. You don't want to be making a coaching change going into the SEC. And ultimately, too, I think with Sark, you want to see what Arch Manning has, right? He brought in Arch Manning. And so does Arch Manning buy him a year where he goes to his administration and he says, look, even if it goes bad this year, dude, I got Arch Manning waiting in the wings. This is going to work. You let me go, you might lose him. So I don't think Steve Sarkisian is in any real danger. But at the same time, you got to win games. And as I've said many times, Sark has never won more than 8 regular season games. I know I just said it. And they should be in pretty decent position to do it this year. But what I would also say is the schedule isn't necessarily super easy. At Alabama in week 2, we know about that. I thought this was interesting. At Baylor, at TCU, and also on top of that, at Houston, which is now in the Big 12. You talk about 3 schools that Texas has a lot of history with that are true road games. Those are going to be hostile environments. Steve Sarkisian got to do good enough. Think he's okay. Sark, if I was you, I wouldn't mess around and go 6-6 and see what happens. I think as long as they go 8-4, 9-3, they should be fine, even if they aren't a playoff contender. Really quickly, 1 or 2 others. Eli Drinkwitz, I saw some buzz about him. It hasn't necessarily been super pretty. Eli Drinkwitz, of course, is at Missouri. Hasn't been super pretty through 3 years. 5-5 his first year during COVID. 6-7, 6-7 the last 2 years. Same time, I don't really see it. One, remember, last year, for some strange reason, the AD decided to give him an extension at the end of the regular season. Didn't really make sense at the time. but he got an extension. It's going to cost a lot to get rid of him. Also, he is recruiting very well. Now, part of it is, and we've talked about it on this show, there's kind of a quirky law in Missouri, very smart by their state politicians, though, where high school athletes in the state of Missouri can only get NIL. Remember, some high school states have NIL, some don't. California has NIL. Texas does not. Missouri, you can only get NIL as a high school athlete if you are committed to a state school. What happened last week? Missouri got a commitment from a 5-star edge rusher from the state of Missouri, and they're in very good shape with Ryan Wingo, maybe the top wide receiver in high school football as well. So he's recruiting well. Big extension. I don't see him getting fired. But again, mess around and go 4-8, and we'll see what happens there. It is the SEC. Money is not an issue. Would be interesting to see what happens if it gets really bad. Do think Missouri will be okay this year. A couple other guys, and these are non-Big Ten SEC schools, so money's a little bit more of an issue. Dino Babers, Syracuse. He's going into year 8 right now. Crazy thing is, he only has 2 bowl games during that stretch. They have come at the most opportune times. Last year was one of them. Think he probably needs a pretty good year. Feels like most people are kind of ready to move on, but we'll see. Jeff Hafley at Boston College started out well, 6-5, 6-6, and then 3-9 last year. I think you get another 2-10, 3-9 year. It gets interesting. Boston College, though, you could argue of pretty much every Power 5 school, I would venture to guess the least amount of resources to actually buy out a head coach, don't have a big booster base in the ACC. See what happens if he goes bad, but I don't necessarily see that one. And then finally, you talk about a lack of resource, a lack of money. Cal with Justin Wilcox is an interesting one. Justin Wilcox, it's been kind of an up and down. You feel bad for him because the COVID year probably hurt them more than anybody. The restrictions in their county were as bad as anybody. They were coming off an 8-5 year. They're only allowed to play 4 games during that COVID season. They go 1-3. Since then, 5-7 and 4-8. But it's Cal. They have no money. They're tens of millions of dollars in debt. I'd be curious to see what happens, if things go bad. Also, keep in mind, they don't have a conference for next year. So it's tough to have that job opening and have somebody good take that job. 1, you got to pay a lot of money in a buyout. But 2, who's going to take the job not knowing what the conference is? So I think he's probably safe. Last thing I would say, just keep your eye out. There's always 1 or 2 guys that you never see coming that end up getting let go, right? A year ago, when we did these lists, nobody was talking about Wisconsin potentially needing a new head coach. Then Paul Chryst gets canned. 2 years ago, Dan Mullen was coming off an SEC title game appearance. Nobody saw him getting fired that year. So stuff does change really quick, but keep an eye out for, I'm not even going to speculate on a name, but again, stuff comes out of nowhere. It's unbelievable. Sometimes the guys that end up in bad shape, but the guys, again, in my opinion, that are in the worst spots, Neil Brown, West Virginia, Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M, Tom Allen, Indiana, Sark, just don't blow it. Just don't be a disaster. Kind of the same with Eli Drinkwitz. That is your 2023 preseason college football hot seat.